But first, I just want to say congratulations. The book is really beautiful, and it's so well done, and just rich, and the characters are so real, and it's really, really, really great. So congratulations for that.
Thank you for saying that. Frank is like literally one of the best writers I know, so it's a big deal. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is how it's going to be all night.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Frank and I are just going to...
All right. So, I understand it is finding an audience, and it's selling well, and doing pretty good so far. Too good.
Whatever that means. I mean, it's just surreal, because I started working on it so long ago, and there were many times I never thought that it would exist. So it only came out at the end of September, so it is still very much something that I'm pretty sure I made up every morning when I wake up. So this is much more fun than the writing and submission part.
Yeah,
it's the talking about it
sure.
being out. Yeah.
For sure. Well, okay, so let's talk about our origin story, how I started your writing career.
No, truly.
So when I was in Madison, I would occasionally teach courses at the UW. They're like mini courses, like continuing education, and I was freelancing at the time, and so I thought that meant I could tell everybody else how to do it too. So I taught this class on freelancing, and it's like a 2-part class, and most people come. It only costs $19.
Yes.
Really good deal. And people come and then they leave and never hear from them again. But Maggie came, and between the first and the second class, she had already sold and written and published her first story, as I remember it.
Yes, I mean I was at the therapist's office all the time, but this particular time I was in the waiting room and I saw the mini courses, the catalog. It was Intro to Freelance Writing. I had never heard of freelance writing. I was a 30-year-old mom at that point, 10 years or so into my coupon advertising career, selling coupons, and I'd never heard of freelance writing, and it was 2 nights, $19, the last Wednesday night in February 2006 and the first Wednesday night in March 2006.
Wow, good memory.
And I showed up and Frank started talking and I could hardly hear him because my head was like, what? And I got home that night at 9:30 and I set up a Yahoo small business website and I ordered business cards that said Maggie Ginsberg, freelance writer. And Frank had given us an assignment to write a pitch letter, which is how you get work. And I, in the morning, I called the newspaper in my town and I said, can I please write for free? And the guy said, the editor said, what are your interests? And I said, knitting. And he's like, if there's a group that's knitting caps for babies in the NICU, that's a story, but knitting isn't a story. And I was like, okay. And then he said, there's this holistic health fair, I don't want to go. How about you go and cover it? So I went and I wrote everything I saw and I turned it in, and he called on Monday morning and he said, actually this is really good, but when you write a newspaper article you have to quote people. So I went back and I interviewed some people and he printed it, bless him, and I ran to class and instead of a pitch letter I had the clip.
Yeah, that's what I remember. That's awesome. Yeah,
and then Frank said, now you have to pitch Madison Magazine. And I said, great. So he's like, do you have any ideas? I said, knitting is not an idea, but I can think. We came up with an idea. I pitched them. They said, sounds great. Send us some clips and we'll be in touch. So I called the newspaper back. I said, can I write something else? And he's like, there's this llama farm. So I went to the llama farm and I wrote the article and I waited, and hot off the presses I ran across the street to the bank, made a copy. By then my business cards had come, so I put it in an envelope to Madison Magazine, the letter we'd written, the 2 clips, and a Post-it note, my business card, and the note said, just a couple of my latest clips. That's how that went.
Did you quote people in the second article?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And then they made me a staff writer.
That's great.
So then I learned.
Yeah, and then you're off to the races. That's the best $19 you ever spent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I had no idea that it was, Frank, I had no idea, I know now, that I was learning about the very best way to write articles. And I do feel like it was all kind of leading here, because it was always that like creative narrative nonfiction that you were doing, that I was so drawn to. And it wasn't maybe the difficult leap to fiction that it might have been if I were doing the who, what, where, when, why type of stuff, because it was, because I learned from the best. So we weren't joking. It really is
Maggie wrote a really nice account of this in her newsletter, which was really good for my ego to read, and she vastly overstates my role in things, because she didn't really need my help very much. I mean, she just needed me to show her, like, here's how you do it, and then she could do it. And I remember you were working in a bookstore, right, at Mount Horeb, right?
Prairie Bookshop, R.I.P.
Yeah. But, you had a sense, I felt like you, as a reader and a person who loved books and read a lot of fiction, you, like, knew kind of what stories felt like and what they're supposed to do. And, a lot of people don't. Like, I've had people show up to my classes, they say they never read books, or they like never read anything, and they want to be a writer. And so it doesn't work that way.
No, and novels were always my very, very, very favorite thing to read for as long as I can remember. I just didn't think that was the kind of writer I was. I didn't think I had that kind of brain to write fiction, and so I just didn't absorb any of the education around writing fiction over the years. I just absorbed all the nonfiction education that I could.
Do you feel like, how do you feel like that informed your writing fiction, or do you feel like there's much crossover as far as the skills go?
I think what happened once I understood that I could try to write fiction, I think I did sort of approach it similarly to the nonfiction, where I had thought of fiction as this magical universe, and you had this magical brain, and you were just overflowing with ideas and just this amazing imagination, and there are writers like that, but I knew that wasn't me. Once I understood that there were a lot of the same, that you could apply the same storytelling rules, I don't know why I didn't understand that before, then it became something that I thought that I could try, because I didn't feel necessarily like I was making things up. I felt like I was interviewing sources about who they were. And when you write an article, you don't have to know everything about a person. It's more and when you meet a person in real life, you don't have to know everything about them. You're meeting them and you're getting to know them. And once I understood it that way, it was more like an uncovering, starting with the characters and how they related to each other, why they were doing what they were doing. That was where the plot sort of came up around it, and then I felt, comfortable, like exploring that like a nonfiction story, if that makes sense.
But then just backing up a little bit, before you started writing this novel and writing fiction, you had a couple other projects that I remember. One was your "Okay, Fine, Damn It" blog that was, I think, pretty popular for a while.
I was
People
a blogger,
loved it.
yes, back in the OG blog days, before it was a thing where people found out how to be sponsored and get paid to be a blogger and things.
Well, and you always had you were always like a really good writer, but had also a big voice too. I felt like, which is a good thing. A really distinct voice and real facility with that kind of stuff, and that really came through in that blog. I felt like, and it did have a following, didn't it?
It did. It was a long time ago. It was a long time ago. I don't know. I was kind of a reluctant blogger, and then once I was blogging, it was like, it was very vulnerable, kind of. I think that I've always written in a way that's maybe a little too personal, and the blogging was definitely one of those instances, and then I kind of, as I got older and made some changes in my life, I kind of wanted to become more private, and then that's when the blogging went away, and I started to hide more in nonfiction. And then you'd think you can hide the most in fiction, but I think the people who know me are maybe...
Maybe not. Maybe you're hiding in plain sight.
Well, I didn't know anyone would ever read it. Literally.
Okay, and then there's one other project that I was going to ask you about that that I remember, but I don't remember a lot about it. That Violence Unsilenced. What was that?
That was a blog that grew out of my journalism, and it was sort of a platform. It sort of combined my journalism and the platform that I built from blogging, and it gave abuse survivors a voice, so people could write in about their experiences with domestic violence, and then we would publish those, and we would also curate we would protect there weren't comments and things like that. We would sort of protect the audience, protect the people who were participating, and that became a nonprofit, like a national nonprofit, and that lasted about 5 years. And it was before you could do that with Facebook and things like that. It was when you needed to wait for a journalist to come along and tell your story, and so we wanted to give people that agency to be able to tell their story if that's what they needed to do in a supportive environment, in a way that protected their anonymity. So that was that
that's
project.
great. That's great. No, so you've always had a lot of energy and drive to make these things go forward. So I was not surprised to see all that stuff since you came into my mini course and knocked it out of the park in the first session. Okay, so then so you worked in nonfiction for a long time, learned kind of nonfiction storytelling and stuff, and then tell us how you kind of transitioned into fiction.
There was a course I took every year called Right by the Lake. It was a week-long course, and you could choose your track, and you worked with a writer one-on-one for that week. And I had taken all of the nonfiction tracks, and so there was, I took a fiction one, and similarly to how I heard the violins in your class, I didn't write anything in that class, but I finally had my mind opened to, there are all of these rules, and there's all of this craft, and people go to school. I knew people go to school for a really long time for this, and I knew that. I just hadn't thought it applied to me, so I hadn't listened. So I started listening, and I started taking classes, and I started reading everything I could about craft, and just absorbing as much as I could, and then I enrolled in a 4-month class with Erin Solello and Ann Garvin, authors, and wrote the first draft of this book in that class. And that was in 2017. And I got an agent right away, and I was like, awesome, this is what I'll do now. This was, okay, so 4 months, so I'll do this 3 times a year, and I don't know why no one told me it was so easy to write a book. So that was 2017. It did not, I did not become Stephen King that year.
This is
but
better than Stephen King.
I went on from there, and there were a lot of close calls and a lot of lovely, lovely, lovely rejections, and I just kept revising and learning and revising, and then it sat. That agent is not my agent anymore, and it sat for a while, and then in lockdown I pulled it out because I wasn't doing anything else, and I submitted it. I was ready to let it go, and I submitted it unagented to the University of Wisconsin Press, and then that was a very lengthy and rigorous process. So
Just the acceptance, or the
yes,
editing?
it was just the acceptance part. The submission part, it took 8 months. It was external peer review and faculty committee vote and all kinds of things, and they published so few novels a year that I submitted it in June 2020. They offered the contract in January 2021, and their first open fiction slot was September 2022. And we went into editing for the year before that, the final year there. So it's been a long journey.
Were you tinkering with it in the meantime? time, or were you sort of like just letting it sit?
It sat for the first, I had 8 months before I had to turn it in to start editing. And they said, you know, you can take this time and just turn in your best final effort. And I didn't open the document I was so scared. And then about a month before it was due, I panicked and started calling all of my author friends and saying, okay, I'm going to turn this in. What do you think? And
I was listening to another interview where you said something about how you wrote it like in a linear fashion, and then started adding dimensions after that. What did you mean by that?
This story that exists is the same story that I wrote in that first draft, in those first 4 months. Sort of start to finish, all of the same things happen. It's the same people, but it still feels like a very, very different book to me now. This version is a much better book, and it makes a lot more sense. The people make a lot more sense. So for example, for those who don't know, Still True is, it is told from the rotating perspective of 3 point of view characters. One of them is Claire Taylor, who is in her mid-30s. She is sort of unhappily married, floundering about through her life. She's new in town. She has a 10-year-old son named Charlie, and she's drinking too much. And the other 2 point of view characters are married to each other, Jack and Lib Hansen. They've been married just about 30 years, but they have never lived together. They live 2 miles apart in separate houses in tiny, fictional Anthem, Wisconsin. And Jack is kind of a straight shooter, jack of all trades, stickler for honesty, fix-it guy. He really likes being in the middle of Anthem, the hustle and bustle of Anthem. And Lib is a very fiercely private, very protective of her independence, lives out on the edge of town in a farmhouse that she sort of tore down and rebuilt for herself. And all of that was there in that first draft. Things that weren't there were the first, I don't know, 6 months or so, like long after my agent had it out on submission, Claire Taylor wasn't a drinker. And that's one of the most defining characteristics of her in this book. That wasn't in the first draft, so that's one example of the types of things that changed. So my agent called one day and said, you know, all these characters feel fully formed, but there's something missing with Claire. Do you know what it is? And I read it, and when it finally dawned on me that she was a drinker, that she had a drinking problem, it was very obvious. It made her character much deeper and richer, but it didn't change anything about what she did. That all stayed the same. And so it was things like that.
Yeah,
that
that's interesting. Almost like she was hiding her drinking from you.
So here's the thing, Frank, because I know you know this. I quit drinking in January 2010. And so I imagine that was one of the things I really didn't want to see in Claire. And also because, I mean, she's not me. And first novels are so stereotypically autobiographical. And, you know, I really resisted it. But it was so clear that was where she was. And actually a lot of the characters are dealing with alcoholism or addiction on some level in varying ways. And I didn't realize that either. So it wasn't until the submission process and, you know, one of the editors said something like, this is an important book about alcoholism, and I was like, oh no, it is, like I didn't. So that was one of the things that completely freaked me out.
I mean, it is set in Wisconsin.
I know. So it's true. So then WPR did a whole thing with like stats and everything, you know, about alcoholism in Wisconsin, Wisconsin's drinking culture, and how you know, the author of this book says this and this about alcoholism, and I was like, oh God, they're gonna hate me when I. Like, sorry,
You're not
Wisconsin.
gonna get invited any
No, never. No more keggers for me. No more garage parties.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That process of like, because the characters do feel really rich, and you know, fully three-dimensional like all of them, I thought, which is rare. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, you made a comment in a interview about how there was math in fiction and you had figured out the math. What did you mean by that?
Well, story structure, and all of the, all of the writers that have figured out, it's math. Once I understood that it was math, it made more sense to me. It wasn't just this creative, imaginative thing, like there's math to it. You don't have to follow it, and the people who are really good at this and have been doing this a really long time probably don't follow it. But for me, that was something that made it accessible and that made me feel like I maybe could try it. So the math for me really was, there are approximately this many scenes, and at the halfway point, everything needs to turn on its head, and at the quarter point, everybody needs to be, in this pinch point, and all the beats of a novel. I just didn't know any of that, and so I had a grid, and I took each of the characters down the left side of that grid, like against the story math, and I lined up their arcs, how they were changing throughout the story in 4 or 5 different ways each, so that I could see at like 67%. If I'm writing a scene that's happening in, chapter 21, I want to know where each of them are emotionally, because that was what made the tension and the clashing and the ways they were, getting in each other's way or making things more complicated. It's what helped me see where the opportunities for subtext were and things like that. It really was just, I guess because I'm visual, like it really was helpful to be able to think about it mathematically and look at it that way.
And did you have all that, like that story kind of, I know at some point you said it kind of came to you, or did the story picture kind of appear fully formed, or did it sort of like piece itself together, or how did?
I knew some of the key things. I knew what I was writing toward. Where there was room for me to discover every morning was how the characters were interacting with each other. That's what kept my interest. It's where I would be surprised. It all kind of, there's like one scene in the novel where every character is in the scene, and it's maybe 3/4 of the way through. And by then I understood so much of the problems they were having with each other and so many secrets they were all keeping from each other that I was excited to write. Like I sat down like not knowing how that dinner was going to go where they're all, because there was just so much between them all. But that was all from that story math. So it's yes and no. Like I knew in the beginning what some of the big things I was writing toward were, but I didn't know how these people were going to grow. Because I was most interested in the conflict, in the questions. I wasn't as interested in answers per se, but I wanted to know. So I don't live with my husband. I'm in a second marriage. We've been together 10 years. We've never lived together. And so we have very different reasons from Lib and Jack, but I do know 2 things. One, I know that it's interesting to people and we get a lot of questions. So like, I knew that might make a good novel. A good problem to give some main characters. But 2, it's easier to not live with a person. Like this is something that we don't talk about, right? Like everybody talks about it with college. It's like, oh, you're gonna have a roommate and it's gonna be the most difficult time of your life, but you're going to get through it and you're gonna grow. Like we don't say that about marriage. This is the love of my life. I'm just supposed to love living with them. Like that's not necessarily. It's just not even logical. So, so what was I talking about? Math. So I was talking problems, like what would hold my interest. So what I knew is that it's actually easier to not live with someone. It just is. And so what is a partnership? What is a marriage? I've been married before and we lived together and that did not guarantee my marriage. Sharing that address did not guarantee my marriage. So what is it beyond that? What does it mean to partner up with someone? and what would come between two people who seem to have it pretty good. Like, what's challenging them? If you don't have to compromise on a daily basis with someone, if you don't always have someone right there with you, reflecting you back to you, you can get to thinking that you're pretty great. Like, when it's just me in my house by myself, I'm like, man, I'm pretty awesome. Like, but it's the people closest to us, like my kids or my husband or whatever, that will be like, and then I'm like, oh, back to therapy to learn about intro to freelance writing. And so Lib and Jack have been doing it this way for 30 years. It's got to be something really big. Like, what would come between them? What would shake their foundational belief systems and, just their core beliefs about each other, about themselves? That was interesting to me.
Yeah, well, we don't want to spoil it, do we?
No, but you do know in the first chapter that someone shows up on Lib's porch.
Well, do you want to read a little bit, and then maybe we can take questions from the audience?
Sure. For those of you who are like my dad, when my mom would drag him along to church and he would check off with the church pencil the items in the bulletin, if that's you, this takes about 7.5 minutes. So I'll just read from the beginning. Lib Hansen could have made the walk to her husband's house by feel and sound alone, her eyes squeezed tight against the Wisconsin dusk. 3 decades spent wearing a path between their separate homes made it all seem a part of her, the cool, slim trails of wet grass across her bare ankles as she cut across her yard, the dip of the ditch and the slipping pea gravel edging the county road, the chemical crunch of city-sprayed thistles already forcing themselves up through the cracked asphalt at the plastics factory where they'd worked for ages until its sudden closing 2 years back. The way the air shifted, ever so subtly, once she hit town proper. Jack preferred driving the 2-mile stretch between their houses, but Lib almost always walked, regardless of weather. On rare occasions, they walked together. She'd asked Jack once if he could feel that change in climate on the trek between their houses, rising now like bated breath, cleaving her nightgown to her calves and thighs, her skin still sticky from the fear triggered by tonight's surprise visitor. No, Jack had answered. I think that's something you made up in that glorious mind of yours. Jack always told the truth, no matter if it stung. Poisonous anxiety surged through her as she darted past the rows of warehouses at the edge of Anthem and the newer jumbo cookie-cutter houses tacked onto this end of town like an afterthought, down to where the green ash and white oaks hovered over the older, more reasonably sized homes tucked closer together. Her guard had been down. She hadn't seen it coming. But now she felt the recognition sink in sharp and deep like a bone ache, as if the cancer she'd never had come back. 2 hours earlier, she'd been in the back garden getting after the ruined tomatoes. No matter how she coaxed, those tomatoes did what they wanted, creating a gangly, sprawling, bloody mess. Year after year, the alleged annuals returned and insisted on their boneless tantrums, breaking free from their protective cages and hurling themselves, vine and fruit, to rot in the dirt. This spring, fed up, she'd winnowed them down to just 2 starter plants, 1 sandwich a day, the occasional dinner salad for Jack. But last year's stragglers had spread, and now they pocked the tidy garden anyway. She leaned back on her boot heels, considering. It was no longer in her to force them into compliance, and maybe that was the problem. Her days of wrestling things into place were over. When the slow crunch of tires on gravel broke through her reverie, she couldn't quite place the sound. First, she thought it must be the mail carrier bringing a package to the house that was too big for the mailbox at the end of the long curved driveway. But her favorite old postman had retired last year, and these new kids never bothered. Anyway, it was practically supper time, the mail long done. She pushed the rope of her silver braid over her shoulder and listened, caught a flash of a firefly in the shrub rose thicket on the periphery, a child on a bicycle wheeling by on the stretch of county road that bordered the sloped eastern edge of her property, the faint smell of charcoal and grass clippings, the drone of a mower in the distance, the steady hum of the air conditioning unit. She brushed the dirt from her shins and rounded the back corner of the house, eyed where her driveway met the front porch, saw the car first, a nondescript sedan, before she saw the man climbing the steps. Instinctively, she froze behind the ancient lilac. He could not see her unless he knew just where to look. He was shaggy-haired, clad in a long-sleeve t-shirt and faded jeans in this heat. She eyed the forward slump to his shoulders as he faced her front door. There was something tweaked about the way he stood, as if his top half was clicked into place just slightly off from his hip sockets. She wasn't a good judge of age these days. They all looked like kids to her. But she guessed he was about 40, and although she couldn't make out the details of his face, even at this distance, she could feel his grimace. Steam rose in curls off the paper cup of coffee he held, and his other hand was raised as if to knock, but it didn't move, as though whatever had paralyzed her had gotten him too. He stood staring at her front door, too hesitant to be a traveling salesman, too casual to be someone needing help. She knew she should call out a greeting. Her resistance seemed more than the simple desire to avoid small talk with a stranger, something older. Just as his knuckles grazed the door, his fist spread instead into a splayed, flat hand. He pressed it there for what felt like a full minute, an almost tender palming of the door at eye level. What was he doing? Silly old girl, she thought, in Jack's motor oil and molasses voice. No such thing as a stranger when a man needs help. She tucked her head into her shoulder to wipe the sweat from her lips and was about to take a tentative step forward when the man stepped back and pitched the coffee cup at her door, where it exploded in a dark spray. He hopped down the steps and strode to his car, slammed the door, fired the engine, and swung the vehicle around, spinning out in a cloud of choking dirt. Lip held her breath until he disappeared around the gravel elbow of her driveway, skidding down the hill and out onto the road. Toward town then, she thought, after she could no longer hear the angry squall of his motor. She waited there beside the lilacs a long time to come back into her body, not unlike she used to when things got bad. There was something in the way he'd thrown the cup, as if she were expected to pick it up, as a baby might with his mother. The awareness was already starting to tug at her, his familiar hips, his age, his fury. She started again toward the house, slower this time, hesitant, keeping her head down as she shuffled through the ryegrass and clover she left long for the honeybees, dodging the ghosts that had begun to drift across her mind. She imagined Jack instead, his blue eyes squeezing into a smile behind the pottery coffee mug he favored, the fine gray hairs that had begun to sprout along his freckled shoulders, the particular gold the maples had blazed 28 years ago to match their rings on their wedding day. When the worn soles of her work boots hit the gravel marking the edge of the driveway, she let her gaze drift up the porch steps. She was hoping that she'd made the visitor up. But it was all still there. Blood rust coffee stained her screen door, pooled in the cracks of her porch planks. The crushed paper cup trembled in the evening breeze. She sprang into action, hosing the coffee from the chipped blue door, from the faded brown planks. The prairie coughed up a wet wind, spraying seeds, blowing the porch swing, tickling the dampness at her hairline. Stooping to gulp from the cold, clean stream of water flowing from the hose, she braced as a fresh fear walloped her. If her visitor was who she thought he was, it was all over. She wheeled off the spigot, wound the hose away, and went inside to scrub the dirt from the whorls of her fingerprints. Fixed a buttered turkey sandwich she left untouched, reheated a bowl of soup she forgot in the microwave, put on her nightgown, went through her usual routine, but triple-checked the locks. It was too early for sleep, but she tried anyway. Shut the blinds against the summer suppertime sky, climbed into bed and pinched her eyes closed, pressed her hands to her face, her breasts, her belly, curled her body into a fist, but it was useless. And there was only one other thing she could think to do. She rose, went back downstairs, pulled her barn coat over her nightgown, slipped on her sandals, and set out for Jack's. I'll stop there.
All right. Does anybody have questions they want to? I mean, I have more questions. So.
I'll ask a question. I loved the book. It was great. And I hadn't thought about this at all until you were talking about the math equation of it. But their adoration, Liv and Jack, for each other is so deep and so long that it almost is unbelievable that she would think it could implode. And there's something about the math equation that, like, her betrayal, he needed to have had this thing with Charlie happening at the same time to feel the loss and to feel that, like, how did you think, and also the distraction that they both had to then just, like, not interact in a new way because they were both having these new relationships, like, how did you think about logistics and the like emotional depth of the timing of that, like to be, I don't know, to be believable that they wouldn't just communicate as they always had. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. That's a great question. Thank you. One of the things when I was drafting, my husband and I went out for pizza, and I said to him, so hypothetically speaking, if I were keeping a 40-year-old man in my basement, how long do you think it would take you to notice? It's like, serious question. And he's like, I don't know, maybe a month? So I was like, okay, that's good, that's helpful. And then I just started to think about, like, it's a true story.
What about a 24-year-old?
Yeah.
Well, right, that might have changed things, I don't know. I started to think about the stories we tell ourselves and how weird time is and how weird memory is and how, like, a survival skill is, like, deciding what a thing means and kind of going on with things. And in Lib's case, I really think that there was a lot of unresolved, unaddressed trauma in her life, clearly, that women, particularly of that generation, and Lib is only 58, she was older when I started drafting, and it was 2017. So the math back then was working out in a way that Lib had become pregnant very young in the, late 60s, early 70s. I know from my life that there is a whole generation of women that have a lot of collective trauma around that they don't talk about. And I know that because my mom was 15 in 1967 when she got pregnant by an older boyfriend, and she was sent to live at the Salvation Army Home for Unwed Mothers 100 miles away in Milwaukee. She was in, on the tobacco farm in Edgerton, and you either got married or you went away. And she went away, and her story is very different from Lib's, and she had a happy ending, but she didn't know she was going to. And it took 23 years before she was reunited with that baby. But she actually, that time she spent there, she talks about the other girls that were there. A lot of them were younger than her. And they would let you hold the baby before they gave it to the adoptive parents. And she didn't think that she could survive that. And so she went into a supply closet and she painted until they took the baby away. 23 years later, they were reunited, love each other, they're great. That painting now hangs in my sister's house. But because of that experience and everything that she learned after that about the other girls who went away, including, we just found last year, that the boy, and I have my mother's permission to tell all this, by the way. I'm not just, that the boy who had gotten her pregnant had also gotten another younger girl pregnant several years earlier. That girl had also been sent to live at the Catholic version of the Home for Unwed Mothers and had given birth to a baby girl who was adopted. And so now my long-lost sister has a long-lost sister. But there's actually a book, a nonfiction book called The Girls Who Went Away, about this experience. And there's so many of them. And so I had all of that swirling around when I was thinking about, would someone really keep this from someone that they're so close to? It was important to me that Liv and Jack had heat and had like a true intimacy. But I was also really curious, did they really? When you are lying to yourself, if that's what she's doing, she doesn't think of it that way. She doesn't think of it as lies. She thinks of it as like protecting her privacy, protecting her independence, not his business. But a lot of that she just still hasn't totally allowed herself to think about. And what is the cost? Can you do that? Can you get away with that? Can you still have a good life? Can you still have a good marriage and a good partnership? Do we owe our partners more than we owe other people? Do we owe our children more than we owe other people? What do we owe of ourselves to other people? What do we get to hold back? Like, all of that was really interesting to me. But yes, I knew it was helpful for Jack to have another distraction in the form of Charlie, 10-year-old Charlie, who Jack has struck up a friendship with. and yeah, I don't know. I think it really was just getting to know those characters and thinking about who they really were, not in a way that I was making up, but just like how people are and the stories we tell ourselves. I don't know if that answers your question, but it just... Charlie, the character of Charlie was important because he didn't come about because Jack needed a distraction. That was just sort of a happy coincidence. He came about because Claire needed something to lose beyond a marriage. The marriage wasn't big enough for me to think about what she had to lose.
Yeah. Anybody else? Do you? I was going to ask what other books you've loved or have influenced you, or authors you like. Are there any that stand out?
I really like Curtis Sittenfeld's work. Off the top of my head.
She's
truly,
here.
truly. All of the authors. I mean, I am not a. I really do truly admire anybody who writes. I really love novels. I love all kinds of novels. I recently have read some books that really just, made me not want to ever try writing again. Ruth Ozeki's new one did that to me. And there are a few recently that I read that did that to me. I don't know. My brother is here, and we are always exchanging books, and so he could tell you what all the books are. Because of course I'm blanking, but the Overstory did that to me. I was like, I'm not ever going to write again. This is the perfect book. But then I also just love, and it's no offense to these other authors, but I really love books that that are more accessible, and just like. I just love to read, I grew up reading like Elizabeth Berg and Judy Blume and Anne River Siddons and those like books that I don't know what that magic was, but I really loved them. I love Barbara Kingsolver, I love Susan Straight, I love Nicholas Butler, I don't know. I'll get into trouble like choosing my favorite children, but I really love books.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so cool that you guys are here. Like, please keep buying the books at the independent bookstores. Please, it's such a big deal. I love books.
Yes, we all love books.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question?
Go ahead. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Jillian.
Felt like it was a love story to Wisconsin, and this is not like talking about the alcoholism part, but like it felt so like lovely and pastoral, and when you would use nature as like its own setting in the small town, I felt like I was sitting with Liv outside of her farmhouse. And so, I know Maggie, so I was like, does she just know what like all these trees and like flowers are and like all these native plants? So I'm curious how much outside research goes into writing a book, and obviously it's different for other authors, but when you know it doesn't feel authentic and you have to do outside research?
Well, I mean, this isn't a book that has a ton of research, but there is some, and I know how I know what things look like that are there. I just don't know what they're called, so things like that. I have, friends that I would ask. I have gardening friends. There's a lot of bicycle stuff in this book. I'm married to a bicycle mechanic. That was super helpful. He claims he wrote page 17. He's right. Actually, he is right. So I have, where did it go? Did I give it to you? Oh yeah, there it is. I actually printed out. I recently found I'd saved this text exchange from 2017, January 20th, 2017, 7:04 a.m. I texted Andy and I said, I need you to describe to me the perfect bike for a 10-year-old boy, and if it had a flat, would a regular jack-of-all-trades have a tube lying around that was the right size? And he texted back, no. A jack of all trades would have a patch kit tucked in the back of a drawer. He'd be pleased with the fact that the glue was still soft. He'd remove the inner tube and overinflate it and listen for the hiss, then scuff the rubber around the hole with sandpaper, wipe with alcohol, apply glue, and smooth the patch over the spot. Then wait, the hard part. Gotta let it cure or the patch won't hold. And I texted back all caps, nice. And then he said he wouldn't have a tire hanging around, and if they bought a tire, they'd buy a tube. A guy like Jack will always fix rather than replace. So keep it simple and allow him to fix stuff. And I said, perf. Page 17. Charlie shows up in Jack's garage, and he asks if he has a tire in there, and Jack says, well, Charlie, as much as I appreciate the forethought of your research, the last thing you need is a new tire, said Jack, admiring the practical kickstand the boy had apparently added and the dirt caked to the bike's frame. The boy's face was similarly dusted with dirt. No freckles, he realized, taking his measure. Most anything in the world can be fixed instead of replaced. How big's your hurry? Charlie shrugged. I guess I'm not really going anywhere specific, he said, the hint of a dimple denting one cheek, a fat raindrop clinging to his pointy chin. He hooked a finger inside his glasses and wiped the fog from each side with a practiced gesture, then swiped at his nose. Just don't want to be stuck, he sniffed. I hear that, said Jack, rising to the old dresser he'd mounted on casters, fashioning a mobile set of junk drawers. He pulled the top one open and dug around until he found the patch kit, pleased that the glue was still soft. He worked slower than he usually would have, conscious of Charlie's eyes tracking his every move. Jack pried the tire off, pulled the inner tube loose, and overinflated it, listening for the telltale hiss. Once he found the hole, he scuffed the rubber around it smooth with a worn square of sandpaper, wiped the surface with alcohol, and carefully, expertly applied the glue before sliding the patch on. The waiting is the hardest part, said Jack, eyeing Charlie again. Gotta let it cure, or the patch won't hold. So I did that sort of research.
Did you just cut and paste that?
Almost. He does have a creative writing degree. Totally just to get chicks. That was just, he's admitted that fully. He doesn't read, so he doesn't read. Most of the book, I mean, it's things like that. And it absolutely worked. It was absolutely a line item on his Match.com.
No, I mean the creative writing.
Oh. Yes, his texts are very nice to read. I think for me, a lot of the research was like drawing on research I'd already done in 17 years of interviewing people. I really think that. I've been looking back on it, and it's like, for 17 years, it has been my job to ask people to explain themselves to me in a way that I can explain them back to you. And so that's kind of how I approached this. And if there was something I didn't know, I texted a guy, or I, there's some gardening stuff. I cannot keep a plant alive. That's not me. So I definitely got some help with a lot of those things. The names of trees, I definitely got help. I asked Eliza what the first tree to turn is every season, and she told me the tree, and things like that. But it wasn't like a research-heavy book. This one wasn't. I cheated in that way. It was just, I've spent my entire life in small Wisconsin and Minnesota towns. And I do love them for all of their flaws. And that was more that. This is a book, I think, about the ways in which we kind of create drama, or that we problem solve how to live in a fishbowl. I think the whole concept of like secret keeping as problem solving is something we talk about with kids, but maybe not as adults, and I think a lot of adults do it. But I'll stop there.
Anybody else? I thought there was one other hand. Yes.
Well, the first question that I really wanted to ask was your question, where when I was reading it, I'm going, Liv, you can trust Jack. You can trust him with the truth. And I just kept going. I literally was wrestling with it because I wanted her to trust him. And part of that is because I know Jack. he's sitting right behind me. And I just thought, okay, this guy's a truth teller. He's a reasonable person. So anyhow, I wanted that. But now I have to just ask, I've been calling him Jack. And I said, you are Jack. So how much of Jack is in Andy? Or should we not talk about this?
No, he says he's going to get a shirt made that says "Not Jack." It's a logical conclusion that people make because we live apart and because he's a bicycle guy. But when Andy got to the end of the book, when he read it, he said, I think I identify most with Dan. Now, for those of you who have not read the book, nobody identifies with Dan. Like, Dan is the husband of Claire, who she's not all that into. And he's kind of a, pretty self-centered, just kind of a schlub. I know. I was like, what do you mean you identify with Dan? He's like, no, I do. There's things about Dan I think I feel the closest to. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, no, I never once thought of my husband while writing Dan. So, no, Andy's not Jack. I understand why people are saying that, but he's not Jack, and I'm not Lib, and I'm not Claire, and it really is all made up. It's just that there are some things I wish I'd hidden a little better. There are starting off points that we share, but no, Jack is his own guy. He's an interesting guy, and I really like the ways that if it couldn't be Lib challenging that long-held belief about everything being so black and white and the truth is the truth, I liked how he had to have it challenged in a different way. I knew that I wanted it to be someone beyond Lib, because I didn't know if Lib was ever going to trust him. And that if she did, if it would matter, because it might be too late for him. So what would be big enough that would make Jack kind of actually finally question if everything is as simple as he thinks it is?
It was a beautiful picture of wrestling with becoming vulnerable and trusting that forgiveness is available and will it be given.
Yeah.
So I thought you did a beautiful job of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't have a question, just a comment.
She always doesn't, she's got an answer.
Maybe this is, but I think that because she didn't tell him Jack.
No spoilers. No spoilers.
No, but because it was a long relationship for 30 years, it's harder to have that truth come out when you've held it for so long. So I could understand her, I don't know that it wasn't that she trusted him so much, but it was that if it was her secret and she didn't tell him, how was he going to relate to that I kept it all this time? So I think it was because of that length. And the second thing is that when Jillian was saying about research, I just felt that a character, I don't know how you think, it was so beautifully written and so definitive on just little Charlie saying how the raindrop came off his chin, how he wiped his glasses. I mean, it's so beautiful that I don't know how that was just so character, every single person, I could see them. You could just see his little freckles, you could see everything, you described it so well. And then beyond that, then you went into the character development, so that you really felt not just a description physically, but who Charlie was, or who Liv was. So that was just so, your language is beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
That's why you're supposed to take a long time to write a book, and you're supposed to have all of the, dead ends that I had, and why people, devote their lives to this. Now that I understand and really have this deep reverence for how difficult it is and what the possibilities are. Now that just seems like a really cool thing that I can just keep trying to get better at, as
It's a
long as I
gift.
can.
It's a
So,
gift.
this book is better for every revision. Like, I, revise. I'm really glad that this isn't the book, that the published version isn't the book that I wrote those 4 months that I became Stephen King.